The dinner rush at the Ivory Room was in full swing. Maylin balanced 3 plates of seared scallops along her left arm, while tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear. The restaurant hummed with the gentle clinking of expensive crystal and the low murmur of Boston's wealthiest residents, discussing stock portfolios and upcoming charity. "Gellis, table 7 needs more." "Sparkling water," whispered Dina, another waitress, as they passed each other in the narrow hallway between the kitchen and dining room. May nodded and made a mental note. First the scallops, then water for 7, then check on the businessman at table 12 who looked like he might be ready for his check. The mental checklist kept growing, but she was used to it after 4 years of working double shifts. The Ivory Room wasn't just any restaurant. With its crystal chandeliers, real ivory piano in the corner, and menu prices that could pay May's rent for a week, it catered to people who were used to the finest things. People who barely noticed the waitstaff unless something went wrong. "Your scallops, sir," May said with a practiced smile as she set the first plate down. The man barely looked up from his phone conversation about some merger. His dining companions, 2 women in designer dresses, gave her the briefest nods of acknowledgement. This was how it always went. May moved through the restaurant like a ghost, seen but not really noticed. Sometimes she preferred it that way. It gave her mind space to wander to other places while her body went through the familiar motions. As she filled water glasses at table 7, the soft notes from the restaurant's piano drifted across the room. A local musician played here on weeknights, mostly background classics that the patrons could talk over. Tonight he was playing Chopin, and May's fingers twitched slightly against the water pitcher. "Wrong note," she whispered to herself, so softly no one could hear. The pianist had missed a transition in the 3rd measure. Not that anyone else seemed to notice or care. By 11:30, the restaurant had emptied except for a couple lingering over dessert. May's feet ached from 8 straight hours of walking on the hard marble floors. She counted her tips in the back room. Decent tonight, enough to put a little extra toward Grandma's medication this month. "Need a ride home?" asked Hector, the dishwasher who lived a few blocks from her apartment. "Thanks, but I'm good with the bus. Got some reading to do." She patted her bag where a dog-eared music theory book was hidden between her wallet and scarf. Outside, the November air bit at her cheeks as she waited at the bus stop. Boston's financial district was eerily quiet at midnight, the tall buildings dark except for the occasional office where someone was working impossibly late hours. The bus was running behind schedule as usual. To pass the time, May rested her hands on her lap, fingers curved as if poised over invisible keys. Without making a sound, she began to play the Chopin piece from earlier, her fingers moving with precision over her thighs. It was a habit she couldn't break, even after 5 years away from a real piano. Sometimes on the bus, people looked at her strangely. This young woman in Waitress black silently moving her hands in patterns. She'd learned to position herself near the back where fewer people would notice. 20 minutes later, she climbed the 4 flights to her apartment, careful not to make noise that might wake the neighbors. Their building was old, with thin walls and temperamental heating, but the rent was manageable and it was close to her grandmother's doctor. "Nai, I'm home," she called softly, letting herself in with her key. Her grandmother's reply came from the small bedroom they shared. "In here, Xiao Mei. Did you eat?" May found her grandmother propped up in bed, a Chinese drama playing softly on the tablet May had saved up to buy her last Christmas. At 78, Lian Zhao's hands were bent with arthritis, but her mind remained sharp as ever. "I ate at work," May said, though eating had consisted of quickly swallowing some leftover bread and soup between serving tables. "Did you take your evening pills?" Her grandmother nodded and patted the space beside her. "Come sit. Tell me about your day." This was their nightly ritual. No matter how tired she was, May would sit with her grandmother for at least a few minutes, sharing stories from her shift while carefully omitting the most tiring parts. "Mr. Franklin tipped 30% tonight," May said, slipping off her shoes and sitting cross-legged on the bed. "His grandson just got into Harvard, so he was celebrating." "That's wonderful. Did you tell him about your schooling?" May shook her head. "Nai, my customers don't want to hear about that." Her grandmother clicked her tongue. "You should be proud of your achievements. 3 years at the New England Conservatory is nothing to hide. It's 3 years unfinished," May reminded her gently. "Besides, it was a long time ago. 5 years to be exact. 5 years since she'd walked away from a full scholarship. 3 years shy of completion. 5 years since the phone call that changed everything. Her parents' car accident on an icy road in Michigan, both gone instantly. 5 years of working whatever job she could find to support herself and her grandmother, who had raised her after her parents moved to America when May was just 6 months old. Her grandmother reached for her hand, turning it palm up to trace the long fingers. Such beautiful hands. Pianist's hands. They're waitress hands now, May said with a small smile. Good for carrying plates, but they both knew better. Even now, May couldn't walk past a piano without feeling a physical ache. Couldn't hear classical music without mentally breaking down the structure. Couldn't fall asleep without compositions playing in her head. I saved a little extra this month, May said, changing the subject. I was thinking maybe we could look into that water therapy the doctor mentioned for your joints. Her grandmother waved dismissively. Don't waste money on an old woman's aches. Save it for yourself. For your future. What future? May sometimes wanted to ask. At 28, she felt stuck in an endless cycle. Work, home, take care of grandma, sleep, repeat. Her old conservatory friends were performing in symphonies around the world now. Meanwhile, she couldn't even afford a keyboard with weighted keys to practice on. Morning light streamed through the tiny apartment window as Maylin packed her grandmother's lunch. Today was Tuesday, Community Center Day, which meant Nai would spend the afternoon playing mahjong with her friends while May worked her double shift. Don't forget your medicine, May said, tucking a pill organizer into her grandmother's purse. And call me if you need anything. Her grandmother waved her off. I'm old, not helpless. Go or you'll be late. The community van honked outside and May helped her grandmother down the 4 flights of stairs. The driver, Mr. Cabrera, greeted them with a warm smile. Big day at your restaurant, no? He asked as he helped Leon into the van. My wife cleans at the Petersons' house. Says the whole family is attending some fancy party there tonight. May nodded. The annual charity gala. Biggest night of the year. What she didn't say was how much she dreaded these events. More demanding customers, more running around. More feeling invisible while serving people who spent more on wine in one night than she made in 2 weeks. At the Ivory Room, the usual calm precision of the kitchen had been replaced by barely controlled chaos. Extra staff bustled around, polishing already spotless silverware and arranging elaborate centerpieces of white roses and baby's breath. There you are, said Greg, the floor manager, looking harried. The Petersons just called. They're sending someone over with special place cards. Make sure those get set up immediately when they arrive. May nodded and headed to the locker room to change. Dina was already there, applying an extra coat of mascara. Heard the governor might show up tonight? Dina whispered excitedly, and that famous heart surgeon who was on the cover of Boston Magazine. May smiled politely as she pulled on her crisp black shirt and fitted vest. Her thoughts were elsewhere, calculating how many hours until her shift ended, how many days until the rent was due. By 5 o'clock, the restaurant had transformed. The regular tables had been rearranged to create a central space where the grand piano now stood, polished to a mirror shine. String lights twinkled overhead, and the bar was stocked with champagne worth more than May's monthly salary. The first guests began arriving at 6. Women in designer gowns that probably cost thousands. Men in tailored suits with gold cufflinks and watches worth small fortunes. May and the other servers circulated with trays of appetizers, tiny pastry shells filled with caviar, prosciutto-wrapped melon, and other delicacies most of the staff had never tasted. More champagne for table 3, called out Greg, and May hurried to the bar. As she carefully balanced the tray of filled flutes, she overheard a conversation that made her pause. Absolute disaster, said a tall woman with perfectly coiffed silver hair. It was Mrs. Peterson herself speaking to the restaurant owner, Mr. Whitaker. Anton called an hour ago. Severe food poisoning. Some street food in New York yesterday. He can barely stand, let alone perform. Mr. Whitaker frowned. Is there anyone else who could step in? Another pianist? Mrs. Peterson shook her head. On such short notice? Impossible. Everyone worth hearing is already booked. This is the centerpiece of our fundraiser. The matching donations from the Gladwell Foundation are contingent on the cultural program. How much are we talking about? Asked Mr. Whitaker. 50,000, replied Mrs. Peterson grimly. Without the performance, they'll only match half. May hurried away before they could notice her listening. $25,000 potentially lost because of a missing pianist. That money was meant for the children's hospital wing. She had seen the brochures on the tables. For the next hour, May focused on her job, delivering drinks and taking dinner orders while trying to ignore the growing tension among the event organizers. The guests seemed unaware of the crisis, chatting and laughing as they enjoyed their expensive meals. During a brief lull, May slipped into the back hallway for a moment of quiet. She found herself near the staff break room, where Mr. Whitaker and Greg were having an intense conversation. "What about that young man who plays on weeknights?" Mr. Whitaker was asking. "I already called him," Greg replied. "He's in New Hampshire at another gig. Look, we've tried everyone. The guests are going to finish dinner in about 40 minutes, and then they're expecting music." May tried to step away quietly, but her shoe squeaked against the polished floor. Both men turned. "Sorry," she mumbled. "I was just—" "Wait," said Greg suddenly, looking at her strangely. "May, you studied music, didn't you? I remember you mentioning it once." May's heart skipped a beat. "That was a long time ago. Where did you study again?" Greg pressed. She swallowed. "New England Conservatory. But I didn't finish. I left after 3 years." Mr. Whitaker's eyes widened. "The conservatory? That's one of the top music schools in the country. What instrument?" Greg asked. "Piano," May admitted reluctantly. "But like I said, it was years ago. I haven't really played since—" "Can you still play?" interrupted Mr. Whitaker, suddenly looking hopeful. May hesitated. Could she? In her mind, her fingers still knew every note, every dynamic marking. But thinking about playing and actually sitting at a piano worth more than everything she owned combined were two very different things. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Maybe, but I'm working, and I don't have anything prepared. And I'm not dressed for $25,000, Mr. Whitaker said quietly. "That's what the hospital will lose if there's no performance tonight." The three of them stood in silence for a moment. I thought about the children's hospital, about her own grandmother's frequent visits to doctors they could barely afford. She thought about the notebooks full of unplayed music in her apartment. "What would I even play?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Greg and Mr. Whitaker exchanged glances, hope dawning on their faces. "Anything classical?" said Mr. Whitaker. "These people aren't music critics. They just want something cultured to listen to while they write their checks." May closed her eyes briefly. A piece came to mind immediately. Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor. She had performed it for her last recital before leaving school. Her fingers twitched at her sides, remembering. "I'd need at least 15 minutes to look at the piano to warm up a little," she said, surprising herself. "You'll do it?" Greg asked, eyes wide. May took a deep breath. I guess so, but if it's terrible, it's on you both." The next 20 minutes passed in a blur. Mrs. Peterson was informed of the solution, her initial skepticism barely concealed as she looked May up and down. The kitchen staff whispered among themselves, shocked that quiet May, who never talked about her past, was apparently some kind of pianist. Dina helped May remove her server's apron and straightened her collar. "You never said you were some kind of musical genius," she whispered. "I'm not," May insisted. "I just studied it once." At 8:15, May found herself alone with the grand piano in a small alcove off the main dining room. She lifted the cover and stared at the keys, 88 of them, pristine white and glossy black. Hesitantly, she placed her fingers on the keys, not pressing down yet, just feeling their cool smoothness beneath her fingertips. Then, very softly, she played a C major scale. The action was perfect, responsive but not too light. She played another scale, then a chord progression. Her hands remembered, even if her mind was clouded with doubt. 5 minutes, said Greg, poking his head in. May nodded, her mouth too dry to speak. What was she doing? These people had paid hundreds of dollars per plate. They were expecting a professional, not a waitress who hadn't touched a real piano in 5 years. She thought about running out the back door. No one would blame her, really. It was an impossible situation. But then she pictured her grandmother's face, heard her voice, and such beautiful hands. Pianist's hands. In the main room, Mrs. Peterson was tapping a spoon against her glass, calling for attention. The dining room quieted as she began her speech about the children's hospital, about the importance of the arts in healing. And now, May heard her say, with the slightest tremor of uncertainty, we have a special performance. May stepped out from the alcove. The crowd's attention shifted to her, confusion evident on their faces as they recognized one of their servers now approaching the piano. She felt their stares like physical weight. The wealthy donors, the doctors, the business executives who never looked twice at her when she refilled their water. Her legs felt like jelly as she crossed to the piano bench. She sat down, adjusted her position, and placed her hands on the keys. And then, for one terrible moment, her mind went completely blank. May stared at the black and white keys beneath her fingers. The room seemed to spin slightly, faces blurring in her peripheral vision. She could hear whispers, could feel the weight of confused stares. Someone coughed. A fork clinked against a plate. What was she thinking? 5 years without touching a proper piano, and now she was sitting before a Steinway grand worth more than everything she owned, facing Boston's wealthiest donors who had paid hundreds of dollars expecting a professional performance. Her hands trembled. The piece, Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor, had vanished from her mind completely. For one terrible moment, she couldn't remember a single note. From somewhere in the crowd, a child whispered loudly, "Mommy, why isn't the lady playing?" The innocent question broke through May's panic. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Then another. "Just play," she told herself. "Just like on the bus." With her eyes still closed, May placed her fingers in position and pressed down on the first chord. The sound that filled the room was like cool water after years of thirst. The G minor chord resonated through the space, instantly silencing all whispers. May kept her eyes closed as she continued, letting muscle memory guide her fingers through the gentle opening measures. The beginning of the ballade was deceptively simple, a calm introduction before the storm. Her fingers moved over the keys with growing confidence as the familiar patterns returned to her. When she reached the main theme, she finally opened her eyes, no longer seeing the crowd but simply feeling the music. The moderato section flowed from her hands as naturally as breathing. Each note connected to the next like words in a sentence, telling a story of yearning and hope. 5 years fell away, and she was back in the practice rooms at the conservatory, losing herself in Chopin's genius. As the piece progressed to the more technically challenging sections, May's server uniform felt restrictive across her shoulders. She leaned into the piano, her back arching slightly as her hands began to move more quickly across the keys. The fast, rippling passages that had once taken her months to master poured from her fingers imperfectly but passionately. She missed a few notes in the difficult runs, her technique rusty from years without practice, but the emotional truth of her playing more than compensated. This wasn't the polished performance she might have given years ago. It was something different, something raw and honest. The piece built in intensity, and May found herself putting her own story into the music. The low bass notes carried the weight of loss, her parents, her education, her dreams. The high, delicate melodies spoke of her grandmother's love, of small moments of beauty found in a hard life. The crashing chords held her frustration and determination. She reached the stormy middle section, her left hand thundering in octaves while her right raced through cascading notes. Sweat beaded on her forehead, her body remembering the physical demands of playing such a challenging piece. A strand of hair fell across her face, but she couldn't pause to brush it away. The audience had disappeared entirely from her awareness now. It was just May and the piano, reunited after too long apart. She felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes but blinked them away, needing to see the keys clearly as the piece drove toward its most difficult passage. When she reached the coda, the final, frenzied section that had always been her greatest challenge, May surrendered completely to the music. Her hands flew across the keyboard, reaching for octaves that strained her small hands, playing chords that made her arms ache. The final sequence of descending chords hit like hammer blows, resolving at last to a final resonant G minor. The last note hung in the air, vibrating through the silent room. May's hands remained suspended above the keys. For 5 full seconds, no one moved or spoke. The silence was absolute. Not even the clink of silverware or rustle of clothing disturbed the moment. Then, like a dam breaking, the applause began. First from a single person, a white-haired man near the front who rose to his feet, his eyes wide with amazement. Then another joined and another, until the entire room was standing, applause thundering as loudly as the music had moments before. May blinked, reality rushing back. The crowd, these people who had never looked at her twice when she poured their water or served their meals, were all staring at her with expressions of astonishment. Some were wiping tears from their eyes. Others were shaking their heads in disbelief. Mrs. Peterson approached the piano, her usual composed expression replaced by genuine wonder. She seemed at a loss for words. "Where did you learn to play like that?" May swallowed, her throat dry. "New England Conservatory. I studied there for 3 years." 3 years? Mrs. Peterson repeated. "But why are you—" She gestured vaguely at May's uniform, the question clear. "Why are you working as a waitress?" Before May could answer, the crowd pressed closer. A woman in an emerald gown reached out to touch May's arm, as if checking whether she was real. "I've heard Anton play that piece at Symphony Hall," she said, referring to the pianist who had canceled. "He's technically perfect, of course, but your interpretation, there was something so honest about it." An older gentleman nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. It wasn't just notes, it was a story. My dear, you have a rare gift." May felt overwhelmed by the attention. For years, she had moved invisibly through this world, serving these people without being seen. Now every eye was on her. Every person wanting something from her. A word, an explanation. A piece of her story. Mr. Whitaker appeared at her side, beaming proudly as if he'd discovered her while Greg stood nearby, his mouth still slightly open in shock. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mrs. Peterson said, taking control of the situation. "I believe we owe Ms." She paused, realizing she didn't know May's last name. "Lynn," May supplied quietly. "May Lynn. We owe Ms. Lynn our gratitude for stepping in tonight and providing such a moving performance," Mrs. Peterson continued. "And I'm pleased to announce that thanks to this cultural portion of our evening, the Gladwell Foundation will indeed be matching all donations dollar for dollar." This announcement brought another round of applause. Woman wearing a necklace that probably cost more than a year of May's rent approached. "Do you know any Debussy?" she asked. Before May could answer, someone else called out, "What about Liszt?" "Rachmaninoff," suggested another voice. May looked around at the expectant faces, suddenly understanding what was happening. They wanted more. These people, who could afford to attend any concert, hire any musician, were hungry for more of her playing. She hesitated, overwhelmed by their attention. She glanced at Mr. Whitaker, who nodded encouragingly. "Play whatever you'd like," he said. "It's your stage now, her stage." The words echoed in her mind. 5 years ago, she had walked away from stages, from recitals, from the future she had planned since childhood. Now, dressed in a waitress uniform in a room full of people who had ignored her existence until 15 minutes ago, she somehow had a stage again. May turned back to the piano. Her fingers hovered over the keys as she considered what to play next. Something came to mind, not another classical piece, but one of her own compositions, a melody that had lived only in her notebooks and in her head during bus rides home. She took a deep breath and began to play. The notes were tentative at first as she translated the music from her imagination to reality for the first time. It was a simple piece compared to the Chopin, a melody that reminded her of her grandmother humming Chinese folk songs while cooking dinner, interwoven with elements of classical structure she had studied for years. As she played her own music for the first time on a real piano, before an audience she never imagined would listen to her, something shifted inside May. A door that had been closed for 5 years creaked open, letting in a sliver of light and possibility. The wealthy audience members listened with rapt attention, not knowing they were the first people in the world to hear this particular piece of music. They only knew that something extraordinary was happening in their presence, something authentic and unexpected. And as the last notes of her composition faded, the room once again fell into complete stunned silence. May wiped down tables the next morning, her body on autopilot while her mind replayed the events of the previous night. After her second performance, she had somehow made it through another hour of congratulations and questions before escaping to the staff room, hands shaking from adrenaline and emotion. "You're famous," said Dina, sliding her phone across the break room table during their morning coffee. On the screen was a video titled, "Waitress Stuns Wealthy Crowd with Chopin." The counter already showed over 50,000 views. "What?" May nearly spilled her coffee. "Who recorded that?" "Everyone," Dina laughed. "As soon as you started playing, phones came out everywhere. But this one was posted by Catherine Chen, you know, the investment banker's wife. She has like 100,000 followers." May stared at the thumbnail image of herself at the piano, still in her server's uniform, hair falling across her face as she played. It felt surreal, like looking at a stranger. Have you seen the comments? People are going crazy, Dina continued, scrolling down. Who is she? Why is she working as a waitress? Get this woman a recording contract. The bell at the front door jingled and Greg stuck his head into the break room. May, there's someone here to see you. May followed him out, expecting to find her grandmother or maybe Mr. Cabrera. Instead, a woman with a microphone stood near the hostess stand, accompanied by a man holding a professional camera. The logo on their jackets read Boston Today. There she is, the woman said, her face lighting up. Miss Lynn, I'm Patricia Wong from Boston Today News. We'd love to do a short interview about your performance last night. The video is absolutely exploding online. May froze. I'm working, she managed to say. Greg stepped in. Take 30 minutes, May. This is good publicity for the restaurant, too. Before she knew what was happening, May was seated at one of the dining tables, a microphone clipped to her collar, trying not to look directly at the camera as Patricia asked questions about her background, her training, and how she ended up working at the Ivory Room. I had to leave school when my parents died, May explained, her hands fidgeting in her lap. My grandmother needed care and there were medical bills, funeral expenses. Music became a luxury we couldn't afford. But you kept playing? Patricia prompted. May smiled faintly. Not really. Not on an actual piano. Just in my head, on my lap during bus rides. In notebooks. Notebooks. I write music sometimes. Nothing serious, just ideas. Patricia's eyes lit up. So that second piece you played last night, was that one of yours? May nodded, surprised the reporter knew about that. The video of that one is getting even more views than the Chopin, Patricia said. People are calling it hauntingly beautiful and refreshingly original. The interview continued for 20 minutes, May growing slightly more comfortable as they talked. When it ended, Patricia handed her a business card. We'd love to follow your journey, she said warmly. Whatever comes next for you, next. May hadn't thought about next. She'd been so caught up in the moment that she hadn't considered what might follow. The rest of her shift passed in a blur. Regular customers who had never acknowledged her before now wanted to chat, several asking for selfies. An older couple left her a $100 tip with a note that read, "For your music fund." By closing time, May felt both exhausted and strangely energized. When she got home, her grandmother was waiting with a huge smile and open arms. Mr. Cabrera showed me on his phone, she said, hugging May tightly. My granddaughter, the star, just like I always knew you would be. It's not that big a deal, Nai, May said, but she couldn't help smiling too. Just one night, one performance. One performance that people noticed, her grandmother corrected. The beginning of something new. 3 days later, May was serving lunch when she noticed an elegant older woman sitting alone at table 7. There was something familiar about her, though May was certain she hadn't waited on her before. Good afternoon, May said, approaching with her order pad. Can I get you started with something to drink? The woman looked up, studying May's face with intelligent eyes. Ms. Lynn, she said. I hoped I might find you here. May felt a jolt of recognition. Dr. Winters? Dr. Eleanor Winters, Dean of Piano Studies at the New England Conservatory, nodded. It's been a while. 5 years, I believe. May's mouth went dry. Dr. Winters had been on the committee that awarded May her scholarship, had personally mentored her during her first year. I saw the video, Dr. Winters continued. Several of our faculty members sent it to me, actually. We all recognized you immediately. I was very rusty, May said automatically. Those runs in the coda were sloppy, and I missed several notes in the... Dr. Winters raised a hand, stopping her. After 5 years without practicing? Without a proper piano? The technical elements can be regained with practice. What can't be taught is what you have naturally. That ability to make people feel something when you play. May stood awkwardly, uncertain how to respond. Sit down, Dr. Winters said, gesturing to the chair across from her. Unless you have other tables waiting? May glanced around. The lunch rush had passed and Dina caught her eye, giving her an encouraging nod. I can take a short break, May said, sliding into the seat. I'll be direct, Dr. Winters said, folding her hands on the table. I'd like to offer you a pathway to complete your degree. May blinked. What? The conservatory has a special scholarship fund for exceptional students facing hardship. We'd like to offer you a full scholarship to complete your final 3 semesters. The schedule could be arranged to accommodate your work and family obligations. May's heart raced. I don't understand. Why now? It's been 5 years. Because talent like yours shouldn't be serving lunch, Dr. Winters said bluntly, then softened. And because sometimes people need a second chance when circumstances, not lack of ability or dedication, derail their path. I have to take care of my grandmother, May said, though her mind was already racing with possibilities. And our rent, her medication. The scholarship includes a monthly stipend, Dr. Winters explained. And there's more. Several patrons from the gala have approached the conservatory about creating a teaching position for you at the community center in your neighborhood. You would teach piano to children who otherwise couldn't afford lessons. May sat in stunned silence. 3 days ago, she had been invisible, just another server refilling water glasses and clearing plates. Now the dean of her former conservatory was sitting across from her, offering her a way back to the life she'd abandoned. I don't know what to say, May finally managed. Say you'll think about it, Dr. Winters replied, sliding a folder across the table. All the details are in here. Take a few days to discuss it with your grandmother. Later that evening, May sat at their tiny kitchen table, the folder open before her. Her grandmother stood behind her, hands gently resting on May's shoulders as they reviewed the offer together. It's too much, May whispered. The scholarship, the stipend, the teaching position. Why would they do all this for me? Her grandmother squeezed her shoulders. Because they see what I've always seen. Your gift. But what about your appointments? Your medication? I'm not dying tomorrow, her grandmother said firmly. And this community center they mention, it's just a few blocks from here, yes? I can still go to my mahjong games while you teach. We'll make it work. May turned the pages, reading the details again. Classes would be scheduled in the evenings and weekends to accommodate her work at the restaurant, at least until she completed her degree. The stipend wasn't huge, but combined with her reduced hours at the ivory room and the teaching position, they could manage. And there was something else, something that made her breath catch. The conservatory had a partnership with a piano manufacturer. Students in the scholarship program had access to practice rooms 24 hours a day, and in special cases, could have a quality upright piano on loan in their home. A piano, in their apartment. May closed her eyes, imagining it. The sound filling their small living space, being able to play whenever inspiration struck, not just in her head or on her lap during bus rides. You've put your dreams on hold long enough, her grandmother said softly. It's time to play again, shall May? The next morning, May arrived at work early. Mr. Whitaker was already there, going over the books in his office. Could I speak with you for a moment? May asked, hovering in the doorway. He looked up, smiling warmly. Our star pianist. Of course, come in. May sat across from him, hands clasped tightly in her lap. I need to reduce my hours, she began. I've been offered a scholarship to complete my degree at the conservatory and a teaching position at the community center. Mr. Whitaker's eyebrows rose, but his smile grew wider. That's wonderful news. I'd still like to work here, May added quickly. Just fewer shifts, mostly mornings before classes. I understand if that doesn't work for the restaurant. May, Mr. Whitaker interrupted gently. After what you did for us at the gala? We'll make it work. Actually, he hesitated, then continued. I've been thinking about something. Our regular pianist only plays 3 nights a week. The piano sits unused the rest of the time. Would you be interested in playing here 1 night a week? Paid, of course. May stared at him. You want me to play here? Professionally? Our customers haven't stopped talking about your performance, he said. We've already had people calling to ask if you'll be playing again. Say Thursday nights. We could bill it as the waitress who shocked Boston for a few weeks. At least until we come up with something more elegant. A laugh bubbled up from somewhere deep inside May. From serving food to serving music, she said, shaking her head in wonder. Sometimes life takes unexpected turns, Mr. Whitaker replied. So what do you say? As May walked home that evening, she felt lighter than she had in years. The weight of abandoned dreams and daily struggles hadn't disappeared, but somehow seemed more manageable now. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Winters, confirming their meeting tomorrow to finalize the scholarship details. May looked up at the sky, where the first stars were appearing in the deepening blue. 5 days ago, she had been invisible. Tonight she was being seen, really seen for the first time in years. And the music that had lived silently within her all this time was finally finding its way out into the world. 18 months passed like notes in an allegro movement. Quickly, intensely, with barely a pause to breathe, May adjusted the sleeve of her blue gown, a simple but elegant floor-length dress that shimmered slightly under the lights. She stood backstage at the Ivory Room, listening to the hum of conversation from the dining area. Tonight was the annual Peterson Foundation Gala, exactly 18 months since her life had changed course. "Nervous?" asked a familiar voice. Greg appeared beside her, now the general manager since Mr. Whitaker had opened a second location across town. May smiled. A little. Different kind of nervous than last time. Last time she had been a waitress in black pants and a vest, stepping in during an emergency. Tonight, she was the featured performer, her name printed on elegant programs placed at each table setting. "Your grandmother's already seated," Greg said. "Front row, as requested. She looks like the proudest person in Boston." "She is," May replied softly, though she won't admit how much her arthritis is bothering her tonight. She wouldn't miss this for anything. The past 18 months had been a whirlwind. Returning to the conservatory had been harder than she'd expected, jumping back into rigorous music theory classes while her classmates were all 5 years younger, working reduced shifts at the Ivory Room, teaching piano to children at the community center twice a week, and performing on Thursday nights at the restaurant. There had been moments when she'd wondered if she could do it all, nights when she'd fallen into bed too exhausted to even dream. But then there had been other moments, watching a 7-year-old's face light up when they mastered their first simple melody, receiving a standing ovation from restaurant patrons, her grandmother's smile when the loaned piano had been delivered to their apartment, and last month she had graduated, finally completing the degree she had abandoned 5 years earlier. 2 minutes, called the event coordinator, a new person May didn't recognize. Mrs. Peterson approached, elegant as ever in a crimson dress. "May, darling, we're so thrilled to have you as our featured performer this year." May nodded politely. Mrs. Peterson had become something of a patron to her over the past year, inviting her to smaller gatherings and introducing her to influential people in Boston's arts community. These connections had led to an opportunity May had never imagined possible. A position teaching piano at her alma mater starting next semester, with her own small studio recital series. "Thank you for the opportunity," May replied. "Well, after what you did for us last year," Mrs. Peterson said, "it was the least we could do. And I understand you've prepared something special for tonight?" May nodded. "A new composition. Wonderful. I'll announce you now." As Mrs. Peterson walked away, May took a deep breath. The new piece had been months in the making, worked out during early mornings before her shifts and late nights after classes. She had titled it simply Service, though its meaning was layered, a nod to her years as a waitress, to her grandmother's sacrifices, to the idea of using one's gifts in service to something larger than oneself. From the dining room, she heard Mrs. Peterson tapping a glass for attention. The crowd quieted more quickly than last year. They knew what to expect now. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mrs. Peterson began, "last year, many of you were present for what can only be described as a magical moment, when a young woman whom most of us had never truly seen, despite her serving us for years, sat down at our piano and moved us to tears. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Tonight, I am delighted to welcome back May Lin, no longer in a server's uniform but as our honored guest artist. In the past year, May has completed her degree at the New England Conservatory, established a teaching program for underprivileged children at the Riverdale Community Center, and been named one of Boston Magazine's 30 Under 30 to watch in the arts. Please join me in welcoming May Lin." Applause filled the room as May walked to the piano. Unlike last time, she moved with quiet confidence, making eye contact with audience members she now knew by name. She spotted her grandmother in the front row, wearing her best dress and a jade pendant that had been in their family for generations. As she sat at the bench, May took a moment to look out at the assembled crowd, the doctors, lawyers, business executives, and philanthropists who had once been just faces at tables, people whose water glasses she refilled without being noticed. "Before I begin," May said into the microphone positioned near the piano, "I'd like to say a few words. The room fell silent, all eyes on her. 18 months ago, I stood where many of the servers are standing tonight, behind the scenes, invisible to most of you. I had given up on my dream of being a musician, convinced that some paths were simply not meant for people like me. She paused, finding her grandmother's eyes. What happened that night changed the course of my life, not just because of the opportunities it created, but because it reminded me of something essential, that our gifts don't disappear when life gets hard. They just wait, sometimes patiently and sometimes not, for the right moment to reemerge. Several people nodded, and May noticed a few eyes glistening with tears already. Tonight, I want to thank everyone who has been part of this journey. My grandmother, who sacrificed everything to raise me, Mr. Whitaker and Greg, who took a chance on a waitress at the piano, Dr. Winters, who offered me a way back to my education, and all of you, who have supported me in ways both large and small. May gestured to the servers standing along the walls. I also want to acknowledge my former colleagues, whose hard work makes nights like this possible. Behind every plate delivered and every glass filled is a person with their own story, their own dreams, their own gifts waiting for the right moment to be seen. She saw several of the wealthy patrons glance at the servers with newfound awareness, some looking slightly uncomfortable with the reminder. The piece I'll play tonight is called Service. It's dedicated to my grandmother, Lianzhou, who taught me that true service to family, to community, to our own gifts, is not a burden but the highest form of love. May positioned her hands over the keys and began to play. The composition started simply, with a melody reminiscent of the Chinese folk songs her grandmother had hummed throughout her childhood. Gradually, it evolved into something more complex, incorporating elements of classical structure she had refined during her return to school. The middle section grew more intense, with challenging runs that showcased her technical growth over the past year. These passages represented the struggle, the late nights, the moments of doubt. Then the piece shifted again, becoming something hopeful and resolute. As she played, May was acutely aware of how different this performance was from the last. 18 months ago, she had played from a place of desperation and surprise, rusty from years without practice. Tonight, she played from a place of strength and intention, her skills honed once again, her confidence rebuilt. The final section of the piece incorporated elements from her impromptu performance of 18 months ago, not the Chopin, but the original music she had played afterward, now refined and expanded. It was a musical acknowledgement of that pivotal moment, a thread connecting who she had been to who she had become. When the final notes faded, there was a moment of complete silence, just like before. But this silence felt different, not shocked, but reverent. When the applause came, it was immediate and thunderous. May stood and bowed, her eyes finding her grandmother, whose face shone with tears and pride. She then turned and acknowledged the servers along the wall, several of whom were applauding with particular enthusiasm. One young man, a new hire she didn't recognize, stared at her with a look of wonder that reminded her of herself not so long ago. Later, after playing 2 encores and accepting countless congratulations, May found a quiet moment with her grandmother near the dessert table. "You played beautifully, Xiao Mei," her grandmother said, taking May's hand. "Your parents would have been so proud." May squeezed her grandmother's hand. "I've been thinking about them tonight, about how life doesn't always go as planned." Her grandmother nodded. "The path is never straight. It curves and bends and sometimes breaks entirely. But if you keep walking, it can lead to places you never imagined." Across the room, May noticed the young server watching them, quickly looking away when she caught his eye. Something about his expression, a mixture of longing and resignation, stirred a memory. "Excuse me for a moment," May said to her grandmother. She crossed the room to where the young man was collecting empty glasses. "Hello," she said gently. He looked up, surprised to be addressed directly. "Ms. Lin, your performance was amazing. Thank you. I'm sorry, I don't know your name." "Lee," he said. "David Lee." "You play music, don't you, David?" she asked. His eyes widened. "How did you know?" May smiled. "I recognize the calluses on your fingers. And the way you were watching, not just listening to the music, but following it, anticipating each phrase." "Cello," he admitted. "I was studying at Berkeley, but had to take a break. Family situation." May nodded, understanding completely. "Would you be interested in playing at a small recital series I'm organizing?" It's part of my new teaching position at the conservatory, featuring promising musicians who've faced obstacles. The hope that bloomed on his face was achingly familiar. Really? He asked. You do that for me? You don't even know if I'm any good. Someone took a chance on me once, May replied. Sometimes that's all a person needs, one chance to be seen, to be heard. The rest is up to you. As she rejoined her grandmother, May glanced back at David, who was now standing a little straighter as he returned to his work. What was that about? Her grandmother asked. May smiled. Just making sure the circle continues. Around them, the gala proceeded in all its elegance, champagne flowing, diamonds glittering, important people discussing important matters. But May's attention was drawn to the edges of the room, to the spaces she had once occupied, to the people still waiting for their moment to step from shadow into light. She had been given a second chance, and now it was her turn to create chances for others. That, she realized, was the true meaning of her composition. Service not just as work, but as purpose. As legacy. After her grandmother fell asleep, May quietly slipped out of the room and into their tiny bathroom. She washed her face and stared at her reflection. Dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled back in a practical bun. She barely recognized herself sometimes compared to the passionate student she'd been. In the living room that doubled as their dining area, she pulled out a tattered notebook from her bag. It was filled with musical notations, compositions she'd been working on in her head during bus rides and slow periods at the restaurant. She had dozens of these notebooks filled with music that had never been played aloud. Tomorrow would be another double shift. The restaurant was hosting some big charity event, which meant more work but potentially better tips. She should sleep, but instead, she opened her notebook and continued working on a piece she'd started last week, a melody that had come to her while she was refilling salt shakers after closing. May's eyelids grew heavy as the digital clock on their microwave showed 2:17 a.m. Finally, she closed the notebook and got ready for bed, careful not to disturb her grandmother as she slipped under the covers on her side of the mattress. As she drifted off to sleep, her fingers twitched against the sheets, silently playing the final measures of her new composition. In her dreams, sometimes she was still on stage, still making music that moved people to tears. In her dreams, she never had to choose between her passion and survival. The alarm would ring in 4 hours. Another day of being invisible would begin. But for now, in the dark, quiet apartment, Maylin could still be who she once was, a musician with stories to tell through her hands. Little did she know how tomorrow's charity event would change everything.